Hey, folks, happy Friday, and welcome to another episode of Plan A Conversations. Listen, folks, I am so incredibly grateful, let me say right at the beginning, for all of your feedback from last week's podcast with Divakar Rogith. I mean, talk about the level of inspiration that you received from all over the world, especially our friends in the southern tip of Italy. Your response in terms of being freed, being supported, being sort of help in discovering your purpose and calling in life in some areas that have been sort of a shadow experience for you where you needed some healing. I was so incredibly grateful just to have that feedback. And again, a special thank you to Divakar Rogith for that incredible podcast. And also, because of the uptick, I would love to know for our folks in Italy in that southern tip, why did you tune into the podcast? How did you hear about it? And what is some feedback that you might have for us in terms of lessons and stories that you want to hear? We always love getting that feedback from you all. And so listen, the beautiful face that you are seeing on your screen right now, and if you are listening to this podcast, the voice you are about to hear is of a great connection. And I say this all the time. I'm so incredibly lucky to meet people and to be connected through mutual friends and colleagues. And the gentleman I'm referencing about the connection, not the beauty, is Sam Ford. I tell him all the time, you are a relationship whisperer. You know who needs to be connected with who. And so I have been fortunate to meet the beautiful Cleo Stiller, who's on your screen right now. Before I get into why I'm talking to her, Cleo, welcome to this conversation. So good to see you.
Gosh, thank you for having me. I do kind of wish we were doing this together from the southern tip of Italy. Yes, we'll be there in spirit. That sounds wonderful.
Yeah, exactly. We are there in spirit. We'll be there in spirit. And so, Cleo, one of the reasons why I wanted to speak with you is you're, I would say, a jack of all trades. You're somebody who is living very purposefully in your social action, in your career, and just who you are as an individual. It literally is something that I believe is you practice what you preach. In other words, is
Mm.
what I'm saying. From your bio, that first sentence that just sort of represents who you are in the world, you say Cleo Stiller is on a mission to encourage health, education, and positive social action around the world. How did we get to that point? Where did that come from for you?
Oh my gosh. Wow, no one's ever asked me that before. Um, so thank you for that question. I I actually had to come up with that sentence somewhat recently because professionally, I spent most of my career as a health journalist. I worked for Bloomberg, covering financial news for them, and then moved over to Univision and did largely women's health reporting and hosted a
Hmm.
television show for them. Then got a book deal called Modern Manhood,
Yeah.
wrote that, and then left the newsroom for to write the book. They call it book leave. And in that process, thought, I don't know if I'm going back to a full-time newsroom. I'm not sure if that's something I'm interested in. What am I if not a journalist?
Wow.
And I had to get really dig really deep on why why was I a journalist? Why am I a journalist? And what I got really clear on was all of my stories, whether it's women's health, mental health, doing a deep dive into modern masculinity, the through line on all the stories was that I really value um, bringing underrepresented voices to the forefront and
Hmm.
telling their stories with the goal of showing everyone how much we really do have in common and
Hmm.
in some ways are also very different.
Yeah.
Um, it really is, I believe a lot in health and community and well-being, and I also ultimately hope that people that watched my television show or read my book or maybe come work with me directly, um, I hear from them. There's a lot of chatter on social media,
Yeah.
but they'll say, like, I mean, when I was like hosting the television show, they'd say, I was watching this show. I was watching your show. Sorry. Oh, that's so frustrating. Sorry. I was watching your show with my daughter, and
Hmm.
it was about women's health. And now we're having all these conversations about intimacy. And thank you so much. And so
Hmm.
it's not.
And what was that show, just for our
Yes.
audience?
Great. It was called Sex Right Now with Cleo
Hmm.
Stiller. And obviously a very provocative title that I chose
Uh-huh.
strategically so that when
Right.
you're on the TV guide, you're like, oh, what's that? But we covered everything from women's health to mental health to
Mhm.
technology and gender fluidity, body confidence. So people generally seem to take the information that the reporting gives them and they
Mhm.
use it to be more proactive in their own lives about being better citizens, about being better to themselves, to their neighbors. So that's where I
Yeah.
came up with that through line, that's the reason.
Mhm. I love that. And so we have a completion point to where the evolved, Cleo is right now. What was your impetus for becoming a journalist in the first place? I'm sure people are wondering that.
Such a good question. Um, so my first job out of college, I actually worked at a biotech investment firm. I thought I
Okay.
wanted to take over Wall Street. And I know you've also had a career that started in
Yep.
one place, meandered to another. So I know everyone will know it, but I'm just curious about your through line as well. But so I wanted to, as a very liberal woman raised by artists, I felt this draw to just take over Wall Street. I was like, they've never seen a woman like me. Let me in. And I gave it a fair shake. And then I worked there. I worked at a biotech investment firm on the royalty side. And eventually my boss took me aside and he said, listen, you're a hard worker, so you can stick with this if you want. I'm sure you'll be successful, but it will be like putting your head through a brick wall every day.
Whoa.
Yeah, yeah. He was like, "You're not made to work with Excel. You're just not very good with numbers, and you shine
Mm.
at this firm when we bring you to meetings. So I recommend you find something where you're interacting with people less and
Mm.
computers more." And that's like one of those inflection points in my life, right? Like it was
Yeah.
so hurtful at the time, but extremely good advice. And so I really had to take a minute and think about, okay, well, what do I like? What am I good at? I didn't want to swim upstream my whole life, you know?
Right. Yeah.
Um, and I thought, well, I really like the news. I like the news a lot.
Hmm.
Um, and I'm good at listening. So
Hmm.
I kind of, moved the needle on some networking. And because I had a financial background, I got an interview at Bloomberg,
Hmm.
and that was it. I'll tell
Wow.
you, one of the first mornings I worked there, every newsroom, the way it works, right, is they have like a early editorial meeting where
Right.
every show or every vertical has to say what story they're covering
Hmm.
and how they're going to cover it. And it's important for news organizations to do that because you don't want your 11 o'clock hour telling a story in a way that isn't does butts up against how your 10 o'clock hour told it.
Right.
And I realized, wow, I mean, this is like, there's a lot of scrutiny on journalism now, but before this, there was a lot less. And I
Right.
realized these people have so much responsibility to
Mm.
tell the news in a way that doesn't make our biases so implicit.
Hmm.
And I was hooked. So,
Wow.
yeah.
And one thing that I'm sure the audience is probably interested in knowing, the moment of the sort of letdown and the hurt by hearing a former boss share this, what was your process? What did you do to be able to get to that clarity of, okay, what is it that I'm really good at? I don't want to swim uphill for the rest of my life. What was that process like for you?
Oh, that's such a good question. I do have to say it's something that I'm still learning now, even, 15 years later, but I feel things very deeply. And
Hmm.
so
Hmm.
the immediate aftermath of that comment was devastating.
Right.
And I think I'm not sure how long it took me, but say it took me like a week or two
Hmm.
to just even look him in the face again. I felt like my world was ending.
Hmm.
And I now know that's you now. It doesn't take me 2 weeks to recover from things like this, but I do know about my own process that the way it initially hits me is gonna feel extremely huge, but I'm very resilient and, like, I'll
Yeah.
come around. So I think I really licked my wounds for a hot minute there, and then I had to think, like, I also take things very personally,
Hmm.
and I knew he was just giving me his best take on it, and
Hmm.
I had to think, "Okay, I know a little bit of what he's saying is true." It is harder for me to report on a quarterly report, like, to draw the numbers from that than all of my peers.
Yeah.
Do I want to do that for the rest of my life? And I was like, "Ah, no." He's right. Like, I
Wow.
don't.
Yeah.
So, yeah, then it just became this really, like, kind of, like, quiet, observation of just, like, I think a lot of people write about this too when what is it called? Mind wander,
Yeah.
um,
Mhm.
without judgment, and just kind of, like, I mean, I will tell you, people listening to this will totally relate to this, I'm sure. Like, I spent weeks just being like, I'd go to, like, a Subway sandwich shop and be like, "Could I do that? Would I be good at the Subway sandwich shop?"
Right.
Or,
Yeah.
like, I would go to, like, I don't know, like, a museum or something, and I'd be like, "Ooh,
Yes.
could I, like, do this?" Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, 100%. And
Yeah.
it's interesting though, because I think a lot of people don't stop to ask themselves these very curious questions when something comes and it's just a negative experience. What we deem to be negative, it's the shutdown instead of that level of getting curious and asking
Yes.
yourself some really important questions, don't you think?
Oh my gosh. I love that you're saying this because the word curious, I think, has so much power to it,
Hmm.
and I try to, like, have another voice in my head all the time that says, "Can we be curious about this?
Right.
Can we be curious about this?" I mean, I'm curious. I'm a very curious person. So I'm curious for you
Mhm.
when you I mean, you were at a studying to be in a seminary, were you not?
Yeah. Yeah, I was becoming a pastor. That was the whole goal. Uh-huh.
So, how I'm sure a path of curiosity, moved you away from that, right?
Well, redirected in a way that made more sense for me,
Okay.
and, like, the path of curiosity came with, Polo Ralph Lauren, and
Yes!
my yeah, my listeners, they and the audience, they know this, but, um, one day working at Banana Republic in Palmer Square in Princeton, New Jersey, this very interesting woman just came up to me and said, "Hey, you don't belong here. There's another store in town that I think someone of your caliber deserves to be in." I go, "My caliber? I'm working retail. What do you mean?" Like, and she goes, if you would meet me at the Nassau Inn for lunch on your lunch break, here's my card. I will have a conversation with you." And then the whole experience just changed because I was able to go into Ralph Lauren and realize that I love artistic creation. I love being creative. I love the opportunity of being able to support people. But the curious part came when no one knew I was getting a master's of divinity across the street and becoming a pastor. When they started just coming in the store not to shop, people are spending tens of thousands of dollars. They were coming in the store at Cleo to say, "I'm having a bad day. Can you meet for coffee?" I'm like, wait, are we
Oh,
serious? I was getting brides and grooms down the aisle, like dressing them and coaching them at the same time. Again, no one knew of my background, and so many different people. I remember it was during Polo had Cancer Awareness Month, of course, for the pink pony was a big thing, and I was like, wait a minute. I'm getting a lot of curious questions. Maybe I need to get a little bit more curious and know that the path in front of me just really need to evolve and become more and more and not serving a microcosm of people, but expanding it. That made more sense to me. So yeah, it's
ugh.
important.
I
Yeah.
It really is, and I think about this too. It's just and I'll be completely candid with you. I got a frustrating email 5 minutes before this interview, and I thought to myself, "Okay, let's put this email down. We're going to take a couple days on this one,
Mhm.
and I can just because not what I thought would happen is not going to happen doesn't
Mhm.
mean that whatever will happen is bad. And there's a way to be playful and curious um, about my response. And it's hard, I think, when you have a plan or a vision for yourself
Yeah.
and then it doesn't, if you cling to that too strongly, right? Um, you can.
Preach, Cleo, preach.
Oh, I'm literally talking myself down too. I'm like, "You know this, girl. Come on."
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And so, speaking of holding on to a vision of
Yes.
things, I am really curious, and I'm sure the audience is too. Speaking of curious, what led you to take a sabbatical or whatever it's called in your field to write this book, Modern Manhood? What was the impetus for that, especially as you were having this really awesome career as a journalist at Bloomberg?
It's a great question. So I was hosting the show. So at that point, I was at Univision,
Oh,
and
okay.
I was hosting the TV show. And 2017, the Harvey Weinstein scandal hit the
Hmm.
mainstream.
Hmm.
Um, it's kind of wild because it was only 4 years ago,
Isn't that something?
but it feels like dog
It
years.
does. It does.
Yeah. So Harvey Weinstein scandal hits the mainstream, and then as everyone I'm sure has noticed, what had started about a conversation. I'll certainly roll Bill Cosby into that. What had started
Mhm.
about a conversation of very rich, powerful men behaving terribly to other beautiful Hollywood women.
Mhm.
Um, there was a ripple effect from that, right? People came out all over the world to share stories. Oh no, that happened to me too, right? I mean, the
Mhm.
Me Too movement, which had started years before by Tarana Burke, it hit a mainstream in a way that was sort of unprecedented, right?
Right.
In the wake of that, a lot of men who watched my TV show started writing into me to say, "Are you going to do a season on this? Because I have so much to say about what's happening right now, but I'm kind of afraid to say anything. I don't want to get in trouble."
Mm.
And then inevitably, this conversation I would have with them, this is like probably by the time I got the book deal, this was like at least 200 conversations I was having.
Okay.
And they would end up asking me a question about how Me Too, through its ripple effects, had impacted some area of their personal lives. And this would be someone who was like, "Listen, I got married kind of young and now I just got divorced. I've never been single during, this whole time, and now the same tactics that I used to get my first wife, those are unacceptable in today's dating world. I do not know how to approach women. I am terrified."
Wow.
I had, which is still very much an ongoing, all of this is very much still ongoing, right? So I had new fathers writing into me to say, my wife and I have been trying to conceive for years. We're finally expecting our first child. Hallelujah. But I just found out it's a boy. And I'm kind of freaking out because I feel like I don't even know what it means to raise a good man anymore.
What?
Like everything that we've been talking about has been making men think, whoa, well, I learned that from my father. I guess I just never thought, I didn't question it. Like everyone did it. So am I passing this on to my son, or am I not passing this on to my son? And then, of course, it was just everywhere, right? We had bosses writing into me to say, listen, I'm ashamed to say this, but I don't want to hire any new female staff. And I sure as heck don't want to mentor my current female staff because it's not worth the risk. And it just was so clear, right, that um, people who had been previously oblivious to power dynamics, power injustices in our everyday lives were waking up to it. And there was a huge opportunity, right, because a lot of women and survivors felt like men didn't care. And I knew from the men who were writing to me that they did care. And they all said, I'm on a group text with my friends. Like, we're talking about this. We're just afraid to say anything. And so this kind of comes back to that first question you asked me, like, where did I come up with this? You know, I'm on a mission to encourage health, education, and positive social change because I was horrified at thinking we're Me Too is a cultural watershed for us, right? There will be, I mean, if history does its job, which often it doesn't, but if it does, it will look back and say, here is what happened, here is what led into it, and are these massive changes that we saw socially and culturally in the wake of that. And I was, and still am, extremely concerned that if we didn't take this moment to really come together and share what our experiences have been, and also come together to decide in what ways we need to up-level our behavior. In a decade, in 20 years, I don't want to have the same conversations with women who tell me, oh yeah, every boss I ever had tried to put his hand up my skirt. I thought that that was normal.
Wow.
Um,
I thought that that was normal.
I thought
And
that
what has
was
been the
normal.
response from both men and women for the book?
Honestly, so positive and life affirming. I was genuinely concerned because I felt like women are going to really come after me because I this is a project in which I very compassionately share the stories of men all over the country, and I think maybe people would have expected a more militant tone to the book that just is not there. So I thought, okay, women are gonna come at me for not coming down one way. And then I thought, and the men's rights activists are just gonna like dox me and share my address on the internet because I'm a woman writing a book called Modern Manhood. But honestly, like people read it and really, I wrote it, so I'm biased, of course. But I think the gift of the book is that it's really not a mystery how we got to where we are. And there's a lot of historical, anthropological, and science based reasons for why we do what we do. And I think that because we don't know these things, it all feels very personal. And so, um, like, I hear from men all the time that they're really terrified to hold a door open for women coming up behind them because they're afraid that women will yell at them for doing that. And that is an example of how on edge and defensive everyone is. I've personally cannot imagine anyone yelling at someone for holding the door open for them. But if they did, right, hopefully you'd be in a place where you thought, ooh, that's on them. Like, I'm not sure what's happening in their world, but I just did something nice. But because of this tension right now and people not understanding the cultural context for where we are, everything feels very personal.
Right, right.
Yeah. So I think the gift here, right, is understanding how we got here. So you see it's not personal. And then the tools that are in the book really allow men and women, I think, to kind of think like, okay, how am I going to show up in this world? Going forward, what kind of man am I going to
Mhm.
be? What kind of
Yeah.
yeah. So,
And I think that's no, I think that's such a brilliant point of and a question that a lot of people don't ask themselves because we don't think of the whole idea of perspective. That word is
mm,
something that I don't think a lot of people bring to any kind of conversation. How am I showing up in the world
yes,
rather than how is it you're showing up,
yes.
and everything is, as you're saying, is very, very deeply personal, and we stop and just pause and say, what is my behavior in
Mm,
this and how am I contributing towards something too. A really good friend, and a quick story, told me one time that one of her good girlfriends got over a relationship and she thought it was way too quick, and I was like, "Really? Why do you say that?" She goes, "Well, it just seemed like really just too far, too quick for her to get over, the relationship." And I ended up talking to the same friend, and what I heard her say was, I asked myself, how was it that I showed up in the relationship to take my responsibility instead of blaming him? And because I did that, that allowed me to heal faster and also to shift my behavior moving forward. And I know they're not like exactly one of the same, but
yes.
that's the question, Cleo, we stop asking ourselves, don't you think?
Oh my gosh. Well, I'm thinking just for myself personally. I went through a bad breakup 2 years ago, and it's really taken me a galling amount of time to process that. And I'm thinking, wow, could I have moved through that faster if I had thought like that? If I had taken I'm gonna noodle on that one, and I'll write you back in a couple weeks and let
Please
you
do.
know. Yeah, I'm kind of having a moment right now.
Yeah, and then circling back to everything we were talking about, that level of
Yeah.
curiosity, that question of being able to ask yourself these very, very curious questions. And so for me, I've been really impressed just in terms of your multimedia experience and what is it you really want to do in the world beyond being a journalist, beyond being, a writer, being a producer and producing really great content
Yes.
and looking for other folks to partner with. Where did that cycle into, this formation of your purpose work?
Well, that's okay, so this is such a great question, and it has a lot to do with getting older and reconciling your ego,
Ooh.
because my first job at Bloomberg, I produced for, at the time, the network's number one anchor, and she did TV and she did documentaries and videos, and so I just was her right hand person. And you know the way that this I always think people I find the way industries work very interesting, so I'll explain to your listeners. Like, the way it works um, in journalism is the host of the television show is always extremely smart, and they came up to that spot by experience, so they're very good. But they have a whole team behind them that is picking the segments for the show, calling the people, reporting it out, putting the notes together, and then at an editorial meeting explaining to the hosts, this is what you need to talk about. This is what I think is where the gotcha, like, this is where it doesn't really make sense. So nail him on this one or whatever. Um, and so I spent a couple years doing that, like really flexing my reporter chops behind the scenes. And it would really kill me a little to then pass it off to another, the host of
Ah.
the show, to ask the questions that I had come up with. And so at that point, but I was a young thing. I was like, I want to ask the questions myself. And so I worked really hard to get my own show, and then I did that for many years, and it was very fulfilling. And then of course the book is not about me, but I did write it, so it's also my project. And then I realized through ego work, right? Through some shadow work, this question of like, why am I a journalist? It's not so that people can tune in and think, what does Cleo think of this? That's not my greatest skill set. It's really not. And I'm not being humble. I'm just saying it's just not my greatest skill set. My greatest skill set is really getting people to open up about really intimate details, with the hope of sharing their vulnerability so we can all feel more connected. And I realized there's so many ways I can do that that don't involve me being on camera. And I also truly believe that there's so many more voices other than a straight liberal white woman, cis, that need to be heard and seen. My biggest gifts, I think, going forward are helping those voices really take center stage.
Wow, helping those voices really take center stage. And like you're saying, it really takes a lot of intra and interpersonal skill sets to be able to look within yourself and say, here's where I shine, here's where I want to shine more, and here's where I need to let other people shine in order to be able to find, their voice. And so many people say, Cleo, that we're in an age where, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. The things that people who are talking about that are disenfranchised or feel disenfranchised aren't really things that are happening, in the world to these, individuals. What do you say to people who take that stance of, this idea of privilege, this idea of power, and um, um, uh, there's no such thing as these things. Like people of color and folks who are, minorities in whatever field they work in, or just through their gender, they need to figure it out just like I did.
Yeah, I have had that conversation a lot through reporting modern manhood, of course. And first of all, I think you have to come to that conversation with a lot of compassion. If you don't, you will just like blow up and have a heart attack. And then to the point of in 20 years, we'll still have to have the same conversations because no one met at the table. But what I offer is historical, anthropological, and scientific research, which proves that power inequity is everywhere and you cannot get around it. And I'll just take like one example that I always like to bring up, is in the work chapter, because work is where Me Too started, or at least for the mainstream, the conversation about power dynamics between men and women in the workplace. And it's become, well, I mean, I don't know when this episode is going to air, but look at Cuomo. Look at Governor Cuomo just having to step down, right? This is a never ending purge, it will seem, right? This is just so embedded in the modern workplace. And people have said, like, when will it end? I'm kind of sick of this. And here's the thing. The modern corporate workspace was never made for women and men, or women and folks of color, or straight folks and queer folks to interact equally. It was originally created for men. Women worked at home. Then, when World War II happened, men went to war. Women were needed in factory jobs to replace men while they were gone. They left the household. It was a very patriotic thing, right? And then when the men came back, women were supposed to go back into the house. At which point, a lot of women said, I don't really want to go back into the house. that was more fulfilling for me. So I want a job. At that point, right? In office settings, like you couldn't go back into a factory work and work with men, but where you could, as a woman, get an office job was as a secretary or support role, a receptionist in the corporate sphere, right? Where you were supporting men. And this will sound really familiar to anyone who like watched Mad Men. That's how it was. Okay. That is how it was. And that was how it was created to be, with men on the top and women on the bottom. And then at no point did anyone say, oh gosh, like look at the 80s, right? When women started to climb the social ladder more, or the corporate ladder more, no one ever changed the dynamics. It wasn't like someone said, okay, culturally, thank you, Sheryl Sandberg, we're going to make it so that there are no more golfing weekend trips, no more late night whiskey shots at happy hour. All these things, like not intentionally, but do keep women out of rising through the corporate ladder. We didn't do any of this. We didn't uplevel anything. We didn't talk about how women and men interacted, right? And so when you have people who feel like, I don't understand what the problem is, I did it, I survived, I pulled myself up through the bootstraps, I don't see what the problem is, they don't realize that the system was built on inequity from the get-go. So
Yeah.
that's just a small example, right?
Right. Right. It's go ahead.
Yeah. No, that's good. You talk.
No, and I'm just so incredibly passionate about this because people think that it's an individual thing and don't really understand it's a system, it's a structural issue thing, and that's why I love Cast by Isabel Wilkerson and the Warmth
Yes.
of Other Suns is just such a great historical anthropological piece of work that speak to a lot of these things.
It's so funny that you say that, because people have said, like, I mean, this is such a compliment to me. But people have said, and on Amazon, people buy Caste and Modern Manhood together. Yeah,
Really?
it'll say frequently bought with blah blah blah. And it's complementary. One thing I heard from men about the workplace is they feel like they're walking on eggshells. It's not fun anymore. I feel like I'm walking on eggshells. And I spoke to one HR representative. She's like such a badass in her space. Her name's Sarah Morgan. She's a woman of color, and she really like leads a conversation about diversity, equity, and inclusion in America in the corporate space. And she says, "Listen, when someone says to me, I feel like I'm walking on eggshells at the workplace, what I hear is, I don't like that I have to think about what I say before I say it."
Ooh.
And to that, Sarah Morgan says, women, people of color, and queer folks have always had to think before they speak at work. And so now we all do.
Yeah, special shout out to Sarah Morgan for
Sarah
that. That
Morgan.
is incredible.
Yep.
And so, Cleo, one thing that I'm really interested in, especially with you and your work in general, there's a lot of the historical piece of what it is that you do. Is a lot of leaning forward with anthropological research. Where does purpose and spirituality exist
Mm,
for you in this? Because so many in my work, even with coaching or executive coaching, you have to lead a lot with stats. You have to lead a lot with, leadership development lingo. And how I enter into the space when I bring in purpose as a lens through spiritual upkeeping and maintenance that a lot of people are not doing, and not being in a full ownership of their body and taking up space.
mm.
Sometimes it is goes on deaf ears, and other times people are like, I want more of that. So I'm curious for you, where does purpose and spirituality exist for you in your work?
It's such a good question. I think so my family, I'm half Jewish, but more culturally than religiously practicing. And my family and the way I was raised is very secular. And so, as I said, then I worked at Wall Street, and you cannot find a less spiritual place than there. And then I worked in journalism, which like you were saying in your work with some executive coaching, it is not a spiritual place. You know, one must lead with numbers and facts. So I think maybe when I turned 30, I felt like things in my life were not really working. Um, I did everything I thought I was quote unquote supposed to do, and yet I was really burned out and really frustrated. And so I personally have done a lot of spiritual work since then. And I think that actually it's so interesting you say that. I wasn't conscious of this before we were talking about it, but in Modern Manhood, which is my latest project, like I appeal to the, like I ask, like, what kind of man do you want to be? You have agency in this time, and you really need to think about what kind of person you're showing up as. And that, I think, is my journalist way of pulling
Ah,
on spirituality. And
yeah.
I think about it for myself. Like I really I deeply care about humanity and humans, and my role in this world, and that feels very spiritual to me. Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
No, it makes 100% sense. And what I hear a lot of people say, especially folks who come on this podcast, they're always trying to figure out what is that way to help people connect deeper to others by connecting a little bit more deeper to themselves. And whether
Mm,
there's a clandestine small way, we're
mm,
not coming out overtly and saying it, but this is the intention that I want to leave you with so that
mm,
you can go out and be a better person and I can be a better person.
mm.
And that inclusive nature of, making sure that there is more representation, there is more purpose-led folks, to me, is probably represented in your work as an Emmy Awards judge. And
Yes.
so
Wow, thank
you and I were just connecting through Sam not too long ago. And when I saw that on Instagram and I saw that the work that you were doing, in hindsight, with the other inclusive works that are part of your path, I said, Cleo's going to be a perfect person for this. How did you get the opportunity and what does it mean to you to be an Emmy Awards judge?
you. I honestly take it so seriously.
It's
I
clear.
I really do.
Mhm.
It's so if you have won an Emmy or you've been nominated for one, you are eligible to judge future Emmy um, years in future years. And I was nominated. I worked at ABC on the midterm elections in 2015, and I was nominated for an Emmy for that award. So I've been eligible to be a judge for years, but I never did it because it felt like a lot of work and a lot of pressure, and like I had so many other
Right.
projects I was juggling. But to be candid, in the wake of the president that we had before the one we currently have,
Uh-huh.
I have just been so alarmed at the spread of misinformation that I feel the need for justice in my bones. And the Emmys, you know, in our industry is such a prized award, but even if you don't work in news, like it, everyone knows it. It's such an honor. And I really felt like I can, in my own way, have an impact here when I see a story that I think like has really nailed. I mean, this is such a this year in particular.
Yeah.
I'm a health judge. Like my category is health and
What?
medicine.
Full
So
circle.
yeah, so here we go, right? So they put me on this, and everything. like every other year, this category is usually like a fascinating category because, I mean, the developments in health. I'm sorry about that.
That's all good.
Okay, I'm not even sure where it's coming from. The developments in health and tech and science and technology are always really just interesting and awe-inspiring. But this year, every single story was about COVID and, you know, behind the scenes of emergency rooms and nursing staff, and how COVID has absolutely devastated the Navajo Nation and they couldn't get supplies. And I just felt so much reverence for my
Hmm.
colleagues who do this reporting, and so, you know, for people who felt like this virus didn't really exist and all the stories were trumped up and it wasn't real. To see all of these stories this year,
Yeah.
I just felt like, oh my god, it was overwhelming. It was frankly overwhelming. And so, yeah, I feel I take the Emmy judging extremely seriously, and it's like you see everything that comes in, like the best of the best, and it really, it's an incredible experience.
Yeah. And speaking of the best, I think a lot of people have so much pressure on themselves to be the best of the best at all costs,
Mm,
to let go of any level of personal self care, to not even be able to be a little bit more purposeful and intentional in their interactions with other people. What do you say to people who want to be their very best, but they're doing it at the detriment of themselves?
no. No, I mean, I walk this line every day.
Yeah.
'Cause I am that person. I
Hmm.
walk this line every day, and I remind myself that there's a lot of ego in perfectionism. And, you know, you have this very high standard for yourself, and society rewards that. So it's not, it's very, like I said, right? There's a reason why we are like we are. Society really says it's honorable to always try your best, even at the detriment of your own mental health or physical health. Um, but that's not, it's never ending, first of all. I always remind myself as well, there's like a couple memes on the internet that are like a woman or a man looking extremely exhausted, and they'll say like, I just need to get through this week, says woman who, like,
Yeah.
knows that is not true.
Right.
It's every week, it's never ending, it never stops, and this this external, I think a lot, I mean, like, you're asking me, I'm literally, this is literally what I work through for myself, a need for external validation, which is, of course, you know, driven so much by social media these days.
Right.
Living in a society that values above all else productivity, you you just have to know that it's never ending and it's never enough.
Hmm.
And at the end of it, what's the point if you're not well, if you can't sleep, to what end? You know, as someone who's constantly set a goal for themselves, achieved it, and the minute I achieve it, I don't even take a second to celebrate. I'm already on to the next,
To the
right?
next.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
if anyone has tips, please get at me because this is
Right.
my life's journey. It's my life's journey.
It's my life's journey. Cleo, listen, I cannot thank you enough for this time together and this conversation. I have learned incredibly so much more about you, love of curiosity, your mission to educate, health, social action, and just who you are as a person is very awe-inspiring. Before I let you go, what are you working on these days, and how can our listeners support you?
Great. Okay. Well, first of all, please do get in contact with me. I'm on every social platform at Cleo Stiller. And I love hearing from people. As you can tell, like I'm super engaged with all my followers and my audience.
Yes.
You guys mean, like you are my projects, and you end up being in books and TV shows. I optioned my book to a production company to turn it into a TV show. So that's in the works. And then separately, if folks hear I now have a lot more free time because I'm not working with a newsroom, and I'm working with people individually who feel like they really have a message they want to get out into the world, but they're trying to figure out, does it go through a book? Is it a television treatment? Is it a podcast? Obviously, Klay, I am noodling on what production company we have to bring your TV show to.
Woo!
Coming soon to a screen near you.
Yes.
So yeah, that's how
Yeah.
people should contact me.
All right, listen, Cleo, we have to have you back for a part 2. I feel that this option for your book is happening very soon.
Yeah.
I would love to have you back and to discuss those things. Any other parting words you want to share or leave with our audience before we let you go?
No, just thank you for being with us in this sacred time. I'm so grateful.
Yeah. All right, folks, listen, you'll have all of Cleo's information. You can find at the base of the podcast in the show notes. Again, you can learn more about me by visiting clayswilliams.com. And I'm on all of your favorite social media by the handle of @PlanA with Klay. That's that Plan A with Klay, folks. Remember that Klay is with a K. Thanks for listening. I look forward to seeing you in our very next episode of Plan A Conversations. Thanks, guys.